Hello.
I'm here with Iain
Oh,
McGilchrist, the one and only.
hello.
You know, your book, The Master and His Emissary, was recommended to me by none other than N.T. Wright. So,
Oh,
Bishop
right.
N.T. Wright,
Okay.
yeah.
Indeed. Yes. Are you a theologian?
I am not, but I do enjoy reading theology, and my
Right.
my podcast, Things Hidden, takes a nod from the biblical passage where Jesus said, "I've come to reveal things hidden since the foundation of the world," and
Oh, right. Okay.
it's kind of a tribute to Rene Girard, the anthropologist from Stanford. Are you familiar with his work?
Yeah. Yes, I am. Yes.
Yes. Well, I've been excited to speak with you, and of course, when we booked this interview at the time, the Wuhan coronavirus had not emerged as a big problem in the West yet, and so it wasn't quite on everyone's radar. But of course, now it is most certainly on everyone's mind in
Yeah.
this time. So,
Yes.
so you're as a neuroscientist, I thought it'd be interesting to kind of get your perspective. I was going to go in a different direction, but now that this unique moment in our, as they call it, our sense making has become quite upset a little bit about how to process what's happening in the world, and your frame of understanding the divided brain and how it makes what we have in the Western world. I thought this would be a great time to try to unpack some of the things you're thinking about in this moment.
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, it's not something that one would ever have wished to happen, and has serious, indeed fatal consequences for some people. However, I think that not only bad might come out of it. Um, One of the things I think is that one needs a perspective in order to have an understanding of the meaning of one's life. And we've rather lost it in the sense that we imagine that we're entitled to carry on living indefinitely, and that if there's a problem, then somehow somebody has let us down. Um, but actually, the feeling that life is precarious and doesn't go on forever, and brings one into contact with some quite deep feelings for people around one, and a sense of belonging with them, trying to help them. None of this is necessarily bad. I know there has been immediate improvement in a number of environmental measures that we could hardly have accomplished in any other. I can't see us having accomplished in any other way. So yes, there's some interesting things there, and they do in a way relate to um, the my belief that we live in a world dominated by the take on life and the cosmos of the left hemisphere, which is a very reductionist one, a mechanistic one, one out of which a lot of the deeper spiritual elements have been emptied. And so, yes, I would see this as a time when we might begin to recover some sense of common humanity and of the seriousness of our being alive and the deeper meaning of being here on the planet, as well as having time. I mean, another thing that's a problem really is that the faster you move from one thing to the next, and the more you fill up your mental space, the less room there is for life. In a curious way, people think that the more they can pack in to the day, the more they're alive. But I think it works the other way round, that the more you try and pack in, the less value there is there at all, and the less present you are indeed in your life. So coming to terms with not having immediate stimulation, uh, spending time alone, being quiet, reading, listening to music, all these things are good. So I'm not belittling the problems of the crisis, but there's always something that can come out of bad. I often think that actually we never know, the things that we think are so good may turn into real big problems for us, and other things that we think are detrimental may turn out actually to have some hidden good in them. So very much the hidden truths, as you were saying. Yeah.
Anecdotally, I've seen a lot of families walking together more in the neighborhoods, not families together, but, families individually going out together and going to
Right.
parks. And I think that's a good thing. I think you're kind of alluding to this idea, perhaps, that we live in the modern world with a lot of layers of shared fantasies that really preoccupy our mind, desires to have prestige or status, or to one up the rival business, or to defeat the political foe. And all these things are so meaningless. Imagine, I always used to think, if you were, on another planet, Mars or something, looking at Earth, you wouldn't know about all the fantasies that we fight about, and the ideological wars that we engage in, and the meaninglessness of it all in regards to real life. All this stuff that we preoccupy our minds with is not really that important. And I think natural catastrophes or natural challenges like this bring us back to that reality.
Yes, I would certainly agree that we're out of touch in terms of my hypothesis that the left hemisphere is not really geared up actually to being a witness to whatever is going on around it. That over evolution in humans, it has become more concerned with representation of the world rather than actually inhabiting it. And that has been left to the right hemisphere to get on with, while the left hemisphere is dealing, as it were, with a map of reality, not the terrain. And I think nowadays we sometimes tend to take the map as though it were the terrain that it's supposedly referring to. And of course the map is a very useful thing, but it's also as useful as it is very partial. It's not a very good map if it includes very much. So in fact, a map is an incredibly stripped down, simple version of the real world. So yes, I think that in as much as we have got carried away by the vision of the world, or the take on the world offered by the left hemisphere, perhaps at some point I should say what I mean by the left and right hemispheres, because this is not what most people think when they hear these terms. They've learnt certain through popular culture which are not correct actually. But in any case, what I'm really saying is the left hemisphere is geared up to do certain procedures. It's very good at doing certain procedures. Rather like an incredibly efficient bureaucrat or even a computer that doesn't really understand what it's dealing with, but is extremely good at carrying out a procedure.
Right.
The right hemisphere is good at actually understanding what this is about. It's a bit, the way I look at it is the left hemisphere is an intermediate processor. So you start off with something that you're aware of in the world through your right hemisphere. And then that's immediately taken up by the left hemisphere and processed in various ways. It's put into pigeonholes, it's categorized. We seem to know what it is that we're dealing with. That has back to the right hemisphere in order to be taken up again into the living world. And that's a little bit like the way we gather information. We put it into the computer. The computer doesn't really understand the information or the import of it, but it carries out the processes we asked it to do. And at the end of the day, it's up to us again to reinterpret it. So that it's a little bit like that.
Yeah, so I
don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it makes sense. Do you think that, the government doing quarantines and things, shutting things down, is that a left hemisphere dominant approach to solving this kind of situation?
Oh, I wouldn't want to say anything like that. I think that would be glib, really. I mean,
right.
What governments do, they have to do, and we're in uncharted territory, and you can be easily criticized for taking one strategy rather than another. It's complicated, and the statistics and the medical aspects of it are best dealt with by experts rather than by politicians. The politicians have to make decisions, but at least in this country, I feel fairly confident that the decisions are fairly well advised by chief medical officers, and it's best for us not to jump to conclusions that it would have been better had they done this, had they done that. We just don't know.
Yeah, I wasn't making a judgment about what they're doing, but just rather, is that a kind, because I don't think of the left hemisphere as negative. So I was just saying, is that kind of a left hemispherical way of approaching the issue of trying to, quarantine, isolate, that doesn't make it it's not a bad judgment. It's just a description,
No, maybe very, very good judgment. Who knows?
Yeah.
And, we started off in this country being rather more relaxed about it than in other countries, and it turns out that we've now restricted movement, and you wouldn't actually be seeing people walking about in the parks in the way you're describing in London at the moment.
Right. Yeah. That's it's been interesting to see how different countries with their different, shared values handle this issue differently.
Sure. Yeah.
Would you say that the Eastern countries' approach to the reaction to this pandemic would be more predictable along the lines of a more right brain oriented structure of institutions, or no, you wouldn't make that correlation?
I wouldn't really make that correlation. Partly, I think it's a mistake to think that the Oriental cultures are entirely right-brain cultures. They're more balanced in that way than ours, which seems very heavily skewed now towards the left in the last couple of hundred years. But of course, they've all bought into the worst aspects of our culture, and they're doing all the things that one would have hoped the sort of wisdom of the East would have stopped them and us from doing. But instead, they're becoming more Occidental than we are. And so you've now got totalitarian states that are destroying the environment and chasing the bottom line. And yeah, that's not particularly helpful. But that's the way history goes. You can't predict it. You can't control it. I would say, though, that they're in an advantageous position if they want to get on top of this, because, it's a country in which people basically do as they're told. That's a cultural tradition, but it's now reinforced by a surveillance state that has more or less total control over its population. We don't have that, and I'm very glad we don't have that, but the price we pay for that may be that we have to put up with a prolongation of this. I don't know.
Do you see? Some people have said this is going to really shake people's beliefs in the traditional ideological battlegrounds. And I think I'm not saying this is the end all that's going to change everything, but do you see this as a potential starting point for a shift? To a new way of remembering who we are. A lot of people have said we may be moving into, for better or worse, a more medieval time, more of a village, McLuhan called it a global village. Do you see that as a possibility of what we're looking at here?
I certainly think a lot of good things may come out of it, an appreciation of things that we've lost the sense of. And I do think that although certainly if the crisis is averted, as I like everyone, hope it can be sooner rather than later, but we'll probably go back to our old ways because they're very enticing. They basically satisfy greed, possession, and pleasure over, things that require a bit of restraint and a degree of self-sacrifice. So, I'm not sure that we're in the best prepared position after 70, 80 years of allowing ourselves to go to seed. However, I do think, yes, I think people will start to think, when they see that I have friends in London. I live on an island off the northwest coast of Scotland, so it's very different for me. I'm surrounded by nature all the time, but people say how extraordinary it is in London, how beautiful it is to be able to, go out and there are no planes going overhead. There are no heavy machinery working. You can hear the birds. You can take notice of your surroundings. And people are not just rushing around in that way, which seems to me so very bizarre that we now do in the West. I sometimes take the train to London. It's the nicest way to get there. You can go on an overnight sleeper from Inverness. And the culture shock of getting out of that station onto a street in London after getting into a train on the Isle of Skye is just extraordinary. And the first thing you notice is how miserable everyone looks, how harassed everybody looks, how filthy the air is, how terrifying the pressure of sound is. Sirens wailing, engines roaring, people shouting. Nobody in the history of the world could ever have thought that that was sane. That is not a sane way to live. And its measurable consequences are that we are unhappier and iller.
Right.
There's some very interesting research by a woman called Jean Twen, who looked at, has been looking at decade by decade, young people and their mental health from contemporary records doing the same inventories going back to the 30s. And what she finds is that there's now something like 5 to 8 times as many young people who score above a certain threshold that is thought to be significant for psychopathology. That's 5 to 8 times, not 5 to 8% more. That is quite extraordinary, and it's not on anything that is vulnerable to things like retrospective diagnoses or fashions in consulting medics for help, because these were just carried out questionnaires at the time, and the same questionnaires decade by decade. So you've really got hard data there. Now, if that doesn't make you sit up and think there's something wrong with what we're doing, then I don't know quite what would. Right.
Well, from a mimetic theory standpoint, from a Rene Girard standpoint, the idea of people moving into packed in cities like that would be desire gone wild, desiring the same object, which is to be in the same place, to chase after the same corporate opportunities in the same status circles, the same nightclubs, the same finest restaurants, that desire to one up our neighbor, to be better than the neighbor, to covet what the neighbor has, is what leads to this kind of absurd situation where people are packed on top of people and uncomfortable.
No, I 100% agree with that. And one of the odd things is that, the level of conformity that you're talking about, the same all the time, but the level of conformity that's now enforced on us by globalization. I wanted to say something about globalization, because one of the things that's wrong is that we don't hang together. We seem more isolated and atomistic. But globalization actually doesn't make this any better. It just reduces everybody to sort of the same soup of, this bunch of people who fall into the same categories, who have the same, go to the same coffee houses, watch the same media, lead the same kind of lives, wherever they are in the world. So that all the particularity, the individuality of place and local culture has been lost. So what we need is not just to relocalize in some medieval way, as you said, and of course we can't go back to another time, even if we wanted to, and there'd be many reasons not to want to in the case of the Middle Ages. But we need a balance always between the global and the local. One of the things about, to return to hemisphere differences, is that the right hemisphere is much happier with a nuanced position, which is not black and white. It's not either or. It's perfectly happy with both and. And it can also see that sometimes a thing and its opposite are very close together. Whereas according to the left hemisphere, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, obviously opposites are just completely as far apart as they can be. But that just sort of obviously isn't the case, as we know from just observing our lives. So what we need always is to balance these things. But in modern life, we always tend to go, this is good, that is bad. So we're going to have more and more and more of this. Globalization must be good. So let's globalize, globalize. In fact, that's one way of destroying the planet. What we need to do is to go back to local resources, local communities, but without becoming isolated, factionalist, and inward-looking. You need to have this balance. And one of the things that happened here, as you know, was the whole drama of Brexit. And I think that what happened there was that something that started off very benign, which was a group of countries having, fairly close relations for trade, working very well together. What happens is a bureaucracy springs up, and a bureaucracy has a purpose, which is to do more of whatever it is it's doing. So instead of thinking, well, we've reached actually the best possible balance, which is of a community that hangs together, but maximum autonomy for the various parts of that community, they started to take autonomy away from the member states and vest it in a central bureaucracy. And the mantra from certainly France was, we want ever closer union. Well, no, you don't. You want the optimum balance of union with division. And actually that is something very deep, that in life we need a balance between connection and distinctness. We don't want everything to be swallowed up in one, but we want to be, as it were, partaking of a community out of which we come and to which we return and to which we contribute.
Yeah, I think that's where that voluntarism comes into play, where you have to be able to, if you want globalism, that's fine, but don't force it. Don't force globalism. Yeah. Let it happen voluntarily. And I think at the same time, the same with localism. I think the future might look more like small, I would hope, my preference is that you have a globalism, but you'll have it more localized. So you have more of a city-state, local control of the way things are going, rather than trying to centrally plan massive populations. It just simply is. It's just you have to be somewhat hubristic to believe that human beings, not in that moral sense hubristic, but just in a sense of assuming that people can plan out the lives of people so far away or so different from their own situation, like a lot of big centrally planned governments are. But if you have more of a patchwork of Liechtensteins and Singapore and Hong Kong, yeah, and more, and I don't mean that in the exact specific way that they're governed, but just the local, decentralized, little autonomous little communities, I think that could be a future to strive towards, so that you don't have to have a one-size-fits-all bludgeon approach to managing situations and differences of opinion.
Well, that's certainly right, and as you know, Hong Kong is a particular example where it did work very well, but because of the desire of a very big power to have tighter control, people are prepared to lose their lives to fight for something. So that is interesting. What one doesn't take into account there is it's not just about government, it's also about business. And unfortunately, although I'd far rather live in a capitalist country than a communist one, because on the whole we have greater freedoms, they have strange parallel trajectories. They tend towards the very big corporation, the very big bureaucracy in the case of the state, the very big corporations in the case of business, and their dominion spreads and they lose touch with the local and all of that. So, you then find that what started off looking benign ends up not being benign, and it's not legislated for, at least it's certainly not in America. I mean, your president, as far as I can see, would be very happy if businesses just got bigger and bigger and wealthier. But I don't think this is a recipe for a stable decent civilization. It is also very materialistic. Both communism and capitalism have this in common, that they value the material over whatever they say. However many pious sentiments they mouth, actually it's about goods, wealth, power, the values of the left hemisphere. And we're in danger, I think, of losing sight of the really important things in life. And that's why I say a crisis may actually bring us back to face some of those losses, to experience what it's like not to have the cocoon of the machine whirring around you all the time. And this is not necessarily bad.
Do you see, I noticed in your new movie, The Divided Brain, the documentary that came out about your work, which is really good. I enjoyed it. In the movie, which kind of corresponds with your original book, that I don't know if it's your first book, but the one that everyone knows, the Master and His Emissary. Is that your first book, or was it?
Yeah. No, it is, but it's the one most people know me for. Yeah.
I noticed that you try not to make value judgments about left hemisphere, right? That you always go back and say, no, there's a balance that's needed, but it seems like you were trying to push back against the popular sentiment that wanted to downplay or trivialize right hemispherical processes and preferences. And you were trying to kind of push, and you were trying to balance the scales a little bit. And so therefore the left hemisphere kind of took the bad boy seat sometimes, even though you were trying to, you were trying to be fair and balanced, but it ended up playing that way, the way I watched it. So how, just to be fair to that, how would we, caution, or how could we think about errors of going too far with a right hemispherical approach? Is there any ways to think about that?
Well, it's very difficult to do that, for the simple reason that the right hemisphere seems to know the value of the left hemisphere, but the left hemisphere just doesn't know the value of the right hemisphere, or even understand it.
So why is the left hemisphere such an annoying little neighbor? it seems like it just can't get along as well as the right guy. It's like I'm thinking of the angel and demon on your shoulders,
Yes, yeah. Well, there's such a thing as being limited so far in your intelligence and insight that you can't see how limited you are. That is the problem there. The story of the Master and His Emissary, which is what the title refers to, suggests that there is an overall overseer that is wise, that doesn't get bogged down in procedural detail. And that master understands already the value of the emissary, because he appoints the emissary as his emissary to go and do a lot of the admin for him, so that he can actually keep his benign oversight of the whole picture. But the trouble is that the emissary is bright enough, but just not very bright in the end at all, rather mediocre, and so thinks it knows everything. And the trouble with that is it really doesn't understand what it's dealing with. So it pretends to be the master, and things fall apart. And there's an allegory for what I believe is happening, that people who have a mechanistic, reductionist, materialist philosophy think, well, it's easy, it's obvious, it's all just mechanical, it's all, all this guff about spirituality and the power of emotion and imagination, that's just messy and clogs up the machinery. I mean, that's a little bit of a caricature, but there are some figures that I can think of that are not far from it at all, and they're very vocal in contemporary popular culture. So I needed to push back, as you rightly say, against that, but also built into the image of the master and the emissary is that although we need them both, we don't need them both equally. We importantly should always have the right hemisphere in control. In other words, to put it very simply, the left hemisphere is a very good servant, but a very poor master. We live in a society where it's become the master, and this is a disaster, because the right hemisphere and what it knows is being pushed out. So in fact, the situation where there's too much right hemisphere doesn't happen. The second half of the book, The Master and His Emissary, as you know, I look through the history of the West at the main movements in the history of ideas, from the ancient Greeks to the Romans, to the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, Romanticism, the Industrial Revolution, modernism and postmodernism. So the whole panoply. And what I see in there is 3 times the same shape being enacted, that a civilization starts off very balanced. There is never a phase in which the right hemisphere is too dominant. It is just in the right position, knowing it needs the left, and the two getting on well. But with time, the left hemisphere always takes over. It's vain, if you like. It's ambitious, and it thinks it knows more than it knows. And so, after a few hundred years, what you find is the Greek civilization declines, the Roman civilization declines, and I think ours is, and it's always after about 300 or 400 years at the outside. So that's where I see us positioned. If we can wake up to this, and really my book is a kind of wake-up call to give people a way of making sense of what they're seeing happening and understand it, then we may be able to save ourselves. I mean, I'm too old to do much of the legwork, but the thing I can do is, as it were, open people's eyes to what is happening, raise awareness, if you like.
What do you think of Julian Jaynes' theory, the psychologist, you know, the idea of the consciousness, the origin of consciousness, and the idea of...
bicameral mind, yes. Yeah. Well, his book was very interesting to me, and I have huge respect for him. And it's a fascinating and wonderful book. And I think he just got it the wrong way round. But in a way, that's a detail, because what he saw that I agree with is that the two hemispheres offer different things, that there's a way in which they both need to be connected and need to be distinct. Once again, coming back to that thing of both union and division.
But he saw the ancient societies as kind of receiving almost a voice of God. They didn't know how to process what was going on in their right hemisphere, right? Is that that's simplified?
That's right. And the way he set that up, that's why his title is The Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, the breakdown of these two separate centers. So they now started being more in touch with one another, and the result was that, you know, people didn't understand where their own thoughts were coming from. That, you know, that's fine. I think most of his idea is great. It's just that the detail is wrong, in that what happened was that it wasn't the breakdown, it was the erection of the barrier for the first time, to such an extent that the two hemispheres started to see one another as alien, really. So that the words that were coming, the thoughts, the beliefs that were coming from the right hemisphere now sounded somehow strange, as through a locked door. What's that? Yeah. Who's talking out there? It must be the gods. So he would have seen it the other way around. I just, you know, although it sounds like the exact opposite, it's close enough. In fact, that detail is perhaps not the important thing, because in the end, what you need is the two hemispheres to work well together, and they don't work well together if they're both trying to work on the same thing in the same way. So they need to be distinct, but also they need to be collaborative. And this is, you know, a very, very strong theme throughout the book that I'm writing now, because, again, we've got it lopsided. We talk about the history of evolution as though it's all about competition. Competition is a very important part of it, but the other important part is drawing together and cohesion and collaboration. And you need both of these for things to work. And in the evolution, you see this. Most animals that have succeeded have done so by actually sharing and helping one another, not by just being this ruthlessly me, you know, nature red in tooth and claw kind of vision that people have of the natural world now. nobody thought this. Darwin didn't think this. This is an invention of certain biologists who will remain nameless, who are very, very big in the pop science field. And this picture really needs to be redressed. We need both, and the cosmos and life and everything thrives on the two things together. And you don't want all of one or all of the other.
Does this?
It's actually.
Go ahead.
It's like a married couple. If I can say this, a good relationship is not one in which the two are fused, in which the two parties are kind of inseparable. But it's not one in which they fly apart either. They want to be maximally themselves within a relationship in which they are, fully in touch with one another and working together. Sorry, I just wanted to say that.
Oh, no, that reminds me of Eric Fromm's idea about standing in love instead of falling in love, and not being...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100% and 100%, not 50%, 50%. That makes you codependent, and that whole pattern of...
Exactly. And that is the serious point, is that people think that it's about 50-50, but it isn't. It's about 100% this way, 100% that way. It's not a kind of soggy compromise. It's actually understanding that a thing and its opposite are required together. I always say there is nothing so good that more and more and more of it is always better. And there's nothing so bad that just a little of it might not actually curiously prove to help. So,
what do you think
it's very good.
Yeah, what do you think of Rupert Sheldrake's ideas about the morphic field, and our brains are like antennas that are picking up these habits? And I mean, is that too far off of your comfort, or do you like some of the ideas developed in that conversation that he's engaged in?
Not. I mean, I think Rupert's first of all one of the most brilliant minds I know. And most people would give their eye teeth to have a CV that looks like his, and the number of publications in Nature and other journals that he's had. I think his ideas are fascinating, and the more we understand about quantum field theory and understand that the world is not made up of little pieces, but made up of fields of energy, the more what he's talking about makes sense. And it's what I call... I mean, I like to think not in terms of taking a system that's linear and saying, oh, well, that branch there needs to be shifted over here or something like that. I think that it's more like a picture that's rather blurry coming into focus all at once. In other words, a new picture stands forward from the same data. And now, with this shift of perspective, lots more fits in. This is what's called a gestalt, as you know. And it's been the basis of some of the most interesting and fruitful work in psychology, Gestalt psychology, which is that we appreciate and understand the world, and indeed scientists and mathematicians make their discoveries not in a kind of plodding linear fashion, but by seeing an insight that shifts perspective, so that all the bits that were there are now reconfigured in a way that makes a lot more sense. Now, I would see his morphic resonance theory as well worth investigating. It's only a hypothesis, but then the world is mechanistic is only a hypothesis, and it's one that doesn't nearly meet many of the facts. It's in fact completely flies in the face of much of what we know now to be scientifically accurate. So I think his time will come. I hope he lives long enough to see the recognition that he deserves.
Yes, I've too have found him quite interesting. And to me, I bring up Jaynes, I bring up Sheldrake, because I like to see ideas, how they interlock and interplay with what you're doing. I just think it's fascinating to see how all these different facets of the same big diamond that we're looking at. It's beautiful. How do you see? Yeah. How do you see the world of? Well, for example, I'll give you an example of the way I look at one of the ways that I've used your theory in application in my work. I have a friend of mine who is a physicist who has a very unique idea of the atom. He believes, and he has a very robust theory about how he lays this case out. But he believes that we foundationally made a big mistake in the world of physics. And one of the foundational errors that we made was back when we were looking at the positive and negative. And we started to assume, well, if there's a positive charge and a negative charge, therefore they have to be distinct particles. And I asked him, I said, well, what evidence was used to develop this idea that there is a what you would call monocharged particle? There's a positive proton, negative electron, and that's just the way it is. And there really wasn't a lot of, from what I looked at the time, there wasn't a lot of scientific evidence to point to there being a monocharged particle. It was an assumption. And I thought, that sounds like a left brain kind of way to move. Not that it's wrong. I mean, I'm just saying, if he's entertained this idea that every particle has a positive and negative pole, he thinks every particle in the universe is a magnetic pole, is a magnetic dipole, meaning positive and negative.
Yes.
And he believes every particle is that way, and he believes all the laws of the universe can be unified under magnetism. And, he makes a very beautiful case, fascinating. He is a person who grew up in the East, by the way, and he now lives in America as a citizen. But, the simplicity of his unification of all the different fields, all the different laws, all the different particles as one universal particle, which is a magnet having both positive and negative poles, it's just breathtakingly simple that to even introduce this into conversation with the standard, established physicists, you're laughed out of the conversation. And to me, I understand that they have a right to, because of the long history of experimental data that they're using. But I think that just like with, Ptolemy versus, Copernicus, there was a lot of very elaborate equations that you could use to use Ptolemy's theory of the the Earth-centric universe to chart the navigation patterns for ships to a very precise degree. It wasn't as if there wasn't a massive amount of empirical and experiential data that you could use to justify the continuance of the Ptolemaic paradigm. But the Copernican revolution, the Copernican theory, won out over time because of the Occam's razor principle. It was the simpler theory, right? And I just think that there's something about the way we do physics and other fields of science where there's too much specialist knowledge that creeps in. There's too much, we have to assume division. We have to assume there is no unity. There is no, it's a proton and it's an electron. Why? Well, we assume that because there's two charges, there must be two particles that are distinct. What if it's one particle? You know what I mean? And that's, I guess what I'm saying is, you don't know much about the theory other than what I've said, but it's just the bias against the unity of these forces and the unity of all particles being one thing, I think is maybe indicative of the left hemispherical dominance of our society.
Well, I mean, lots to say about that, but first of all, perhaps I should say that, science is always a question of a theory, a hypothesis, and we just replace a worse one with a better one, we hope. And every position you adopt, you can see some things you couldn't from another, but it may exclude you from seeing something new. On physics, I've found that physicists are among the most open-minded people I know. They're far less dogmatic than biologists who are still working in a 19th century hydraulic mechanistic paradigm. Lots of physicists, one of the surprises of my book was finding how many physicists wrote to me saying this is terribly interesting because it actually makes a lot of sense in terms of the work I'm doing. And I've written more about the physics angle in the book I've just completed writing, which I hope will be called The Matter with Things, which is about things and matter apart from anything else. But yeah, I think physicists nowadays would be very loath to take this it's all the separate particles view. My reading is that they're enormously open to the idea that it's nothing like that at all, that it's very hard, in fact, to conceptualize or put into language, but it seems to be able to combine fluidity with the possibility of a specific particular piece of information, and that particles are probably never completely separate. They are entangled in certain ways, which explain, so-called faster than light transmission of information. The two entangled particles are not really separate, so it doesn't have to do that.
Right.
So, yeah, I think that's important, but I want to say the dipole idea, I don't know who this physicist is, perhaps you can later tell me, but I think that's an enormously powerful image, which is pretty much likely to be on to the money. After 30 chapters in my new book, I have the last chapter on the coincidence of opposites. And essentially the problem is that we think of opposites, as I was saying earlier, as being wholly distinct rather than being parts of a dipole.
Interesting.
And indeed the hemispheres are really like that. The left and right hemispheres are really, in a way, they're sort of dipolar in their arrangement.
They're like a magnet. We have a little magnetic brain, right?
Yeah. And you can't, it makes no sense to say, well, we want one without the other. You can't take a bar magnet and say, well, I like the North Pole, I'm going to cut off the South Pole. I mean, you've just got a shorter magnet, but it's still got a South Pole. So you can't in any way get away from that. And this is very ancient wisdom in the Orient, and also in Heraclitus, who has this fantastic image of the lyre or the bow, the strength of the bow and the power of the lyre to produce music comes not from a compromise or a kind of static position, but from a string being pulled maximally in opposite directions as hard as it can be, and its power comes out of that tension. If you see life in terms of the dipoles that are not really clean-cut opposites, a lot of things start to fall into place.
Yeah, that's fascinating. His name is Weiping Yu, and he is a physicist here in Florida, and his theory is called the Yuan theory, and it's just breathtakingly refreshing, because he uses physical demonstrations of the physical objects in the world to be his. He does have equations that he's developed, but he starts with physical demonstrations that even a child can understand. And I think it's just very inspirational watching him develop this theory, and he's become a close friend of mine. But I think you're right. That's why I brought it up, is that I think your work was one of the reasons that I used as a kind of discernment toolkit within my arsenal, that when I engaged his theory and I started to understand, okay, everything is the universal particle he's identified as a dipolar magnetic particle, and then he uses that to build out all the different laws and unifies them and simplifies them, and he uses that to build out a unification of the macro and the micro and the subatomic, and then he uses that to inform things like what's going on with morphic fields, and then he uses that to inform and of course he's not going into the depths with each of those fields outside of physics, but he provides a little bit of a framework of guidance to how to continue developing this dipolar magnetic universe in these various fields. Right. That really makes things click better for me.
Well, it sounds fascinating. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate your time, and I want to just be mindful of trying to be concise with our time together. But I do want to end it by thinking about something closer to home, which is what can folks do to cultivate a balanced way of learning and absorbing the world, a right brain balanced approach with their children. How can they cultivate that in the young that they have around them?
Well, that's a very good question. I think, as often, I'm a psychiatrist, and so I'm used to the fact that when people have a problem, the first thing to do is to help them stop doing the things that are not working, and they will then be in a position to find the things that do work. So most of the things that we do, which is to over control our children, I mean, they don't have proper boundaries on the one hand, but they're over monitored and, you know, helicoptered. They need more space, they need more time to play, they need to be encouraged to learn not things that are in any way an easy option, but are powerfully important to the development of a socialized individual who can take part in a civilized community, namely to learn the things that are now being marginalized, to read literature, to listen to music, to learn history, perhaps to know about classical civilization, as well as the STEM subjects. I'm not saying they're not important, but of course, what people hear, if they're very left-brained, is like, it's got to be all this or it's got to be all that. But I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we're losing track of the really important stuff here. You can get people who are technically proficient without being educated. Education is not a matter of information. It's a matter of drawing out from inside a person their latent imagination, which is not just a matter of fantasy. It's imagination that's required for innovation. It's imagination that's required for doing maths as well as for great art and the things that really enrich our lives. So yes, we've got to stop this over-monitored, over-technicalized way of bringing up children. And this does not mean a soft option. In fact, it would probably be more rigorous. I'd like to see higher standards and children held to higher standards and made to feel that actually what they do is important and interesting, not passively receiving information, which is enough to bore any child. And if they're intelligent and imaginative, they'll just find their education is a matter of, taking on board stuff that they're supposed to swallow and regurgitate for an exam. Well, that is not an education either. And it's a way of killing off creativity. So, I'd start there. I think that the practice of allowing children to ramble in natural setting is very important. I think if possible, we should not lose the habit of having practices which children can begin to learn about being silent, being quiet, learning the principles of mindfulness and meditation, perhaps only for short periods to begin with. And I think that should be part of schooling. And I think that we should stop trying to indoctrinate them in our ideas. Fortunately, when I was at school, free thinking was still allowed and was actually thought to be the purpose of education. And, we were taught to argue a position and then, okay, you did that fine. Now argue the exact opposite position and we'll see how well you do at that. Now, that kind of way of thinking sort of loosens up your mind and frees you up from all the dogmas that are pushed down people's throats nowadays. So, there's a lot there. I could talk for an hour about what I think of the way we bring up children, but that might be a touch of it.
Well, that's very good. And do you see that as we continue to investigate ways of balancing this hemispherical approach to our society, that it will result in a less coercion-dependent society, a more voluntary, consensual-based society? One of the things that Rene Girard was good about identifying for me is the idea that the social contract theory is not really grounded in reality. It's rather a mythology that conceals a real violence that originates in our need to, have a sacred order that is mediated through common enemies or common scapegoats, common taboo behaviors that are enforced by violence. Now, obviously, you're always going to need force to constrain things like assault and rape and murder and fraud and things like that. But so much of our life is heavily bureaucratized and coercively managed. Do you see that a right brain hemispherical approach that balances the overly left brain dominated society would be a way to release that need for coercion to solve so many things in our lives?
Well, yes, in a rough and ready way, one of the things about the left hemisphere is that, as I say, its raison d'etre is to be controlling. It's about the exertion of power over the environment in our service. So it's keen on control, it's keen on rules, it's takes a very bureaucratic, if you like, categorical way of looking at the world. The right hemisphere is by definition better at getting a sense of proportion because it sees the whole picture, in which inevitably you see whatever it is you're obsessing about in a wider perspective, both temporally and spatially. And I think the one thing that can come out of a crisis such as the current one is that we suddenly zoom back from the things that we've got our nose pressed up against and seem so steamed up about, and start thinking about, you know, the bigger picture here and get a sense of proportion. And with a sense of proportion come two things that are really absent from the common culture now. One is it's the only way to begin on the path to wisdom. Not to follow a dogma or a strict set of rules, but to get a sense of proportion. And to do that, you need to know a lot, to think a lot, to be quiet a lot, to experience a lot. And the other is sense of humor. Sense of humor is a hugely undervalued faculty that is, again, a human faculty. And it's as important as any other one we have. It's healing. It brings people together, it deflects anger and aggression, and the way we've put a lid on humor is one of the most toxic things about our culture at the moment. Interestingly, some research has come out that people who have a black sense of humor are more intelligent, healthier, and do better in the world than people who don't. So, you know, there's perhaps a little bit of wisdom in that.
Yeah, it reminds me of the way Jesus dealt with the occupation of his people at the time, where he would say, if your predator oppressors come for your cloak, give them your tunic too, you know, because the whole audience would be laughing at that, because he was, you know, he's teaching you not to resist with reciprocal violence when they come to take your outer garment in an act of dominance, but rather just give them the whole outfit so you'll be naked, and it'll embarrass them to look at you more than for you to give the rest of your outfit. That's performance art. Yeah. What he's doing there is performance art. It's a way of that dark humor that helps people, you know? Yeah. Well, Dr. Iain McGilchrist, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. It's an honor to learn from you, as always. Can you tell us about that new book coming out so people can be mindful of it, or does it not have a title yet? Or
Well, I haven't. I'm editing it at the moment, and I hope it'll come out in perhaps a little over a year. It will come out with Penguin Random House. My chosen title, my editor doesn't know that yet, is The Matter with Things. And it's really a kind of pushback against the reductionist view of the world, which I think people have come to realize is pathetically diminished and simply doesn't answer to any of the important experiences we have. So I'm using a reasoned and scientific approach to say, how do we know that certain things are truer than other things? And to bring back into play reason and science together with intuition and imagination, to look at the foundations of the cosmos, things like space, time, consciousness, matter, values, and the sense of the sacred, where they come from and what their meaning is. So it's a big, big book. It's like twice as big as the Master and His Emissary. Oh, wow. I'm never going to write a bigger book than this one.
Is this the magnum opus?
So we'll see what. Well, yes. I mean, if they're able to publish it, I mean, any publisher might well say we can't publish this as one book, but there we are. We'll see. We'll see.
Well, best of luck, and in the meantime, I encourage people to check out your book, your movie documentary, The Divided Brain, for those who are wanting to get introduced to the topic.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, and there's also a very good little RSA animate on YouTube, which gives you the gist in 10 minutes, which is, quite useful.
I think your work is very important for charting the future, and together with some of the different theories and ideas that I've kind of tried to bring up in this topic, I think this is a recipe for a whole new paradigm shift in the way we can handle our affairs in a more peaceful and prosperous way, you know?
I very much hope so, because the alternative is that there will be things get very, very much better, worse before they get better. So if we can forestall that, that would be great.
Well, thanks once again, and be safe and take care of yourself. We'll talk soon. Thank you.
You too. Yes. Thank you very much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Bye-bye.